If you don't mind, I'm going to take off my jacket. It's getting hot. Well, I don't guess I am. I'm all caught, so we'll leave it alone. I do apologize for that. That's not on tape, is it, Andy? So delete that part. So, and I also want to apologize for the odor you might be smelling. I have no clue what it is, but please accept our apology, especially for those of you who are visiting us. We don't normally smell this way, okay? So please. Thank you. So, Belinda asked me this morning, she said, what was that odor? As soon as they turned on the air conditioner, I smelled this odor. I said, what are you talking about? She said, you didn't smell it? I said, no. She said, it smelled like stinky feet. And I started looking around to see if somebody took off their shoes. I hope none of you took your shoes off this morning. I'm glad that you're here this evening. I'm trying to go long enough so we can avoid the entire Super Bowl for those of you who are wanting to go home and watch the Super Bowl. Of course, I'm teasing. We just sang a song, I Gave My Life for Thee. Open your songbook to that song again. I gave my life for Thee. 354. Notice the lyrics here. I gave my life for Thee, my precious blood I shed, that Thou mightst ransom be and quicken from the dead. I gave my life for Thee, what hast Thou given for me? My Father's house of light, my glory-circled throne, I left for earthly night, for wandering and alone. I left it all for Thee, hast Thou left aught for me? I have suffered much for Thee, more than the tongue can tell, of bitterest agony, to rescue from hell. I borne it all for Thee, what hast Thou borne for me? And I have brought to Thee, down from my home above, salvation full and free, my pardon and my love, I bring rich gifts to Thee. What hast Thou brought for me? Do we notice what this song is saying about Jesus? It articulates it very well. Notice what it says. Notice what He has done for us. He gave His life for us. He shed His blood for us. He ransomed us. He left heaven for us. He suffered for us. He rescued us. He saved us. He pardoned us. He loves us. And He gifted us. And isn't that all true? He has done these things for us. But then notice that there are 4 questions that are asked. What hast Thou given for me? Hast Thou left aught for me? What hast Thou borne for me? What hast Thou brought to me? So when we sing this song, I wonder if we really contemplate these questions. I wonder if we really focus on what we are saying. When we look at these questions, really, it's asking, what will we do for Jesus? What will we do for Jesus? When we consider all the wonderful things He has done for us, what will we do for Him? So let's talk about this for a moment. What will we do for Jesus? Now, I know you can come up with a lot of things as to what you will do for Jesus, what we can do for Jesus, and what we should do for Jesus. But the things that I want to suggest tonight, they're not optional. The things that we should do for Jesus, the things that we want to do for Jesus, the things that we will do for Jesus are not optional. So what will we do for Jesus? We will love Him. We will love Him more than all other things. If that's what if we believe this, then we will love Him more than all other things. When you take into consideration all the wonderful things He has done for us, it should be easy for us to say, well, we will love Him more than all other things. Not just love Him, but love Him more than all other things. It's easy to say, I love him. It's easy to say that, but it's more difficult to demonstrate that. We will love him more than all other things. You remember when Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 names his apostles, he then sends them out. And he talks about the challenges of being a disciple. The challenges that you and I have experienced, the challenges that we face every day. He talks about the challenges of being a follower of Jesus. And he says in verse 34, do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. You hear what Jesus is saying? When a lot of people read this, they're going to say, you know what? Forget it. I'm not following you if it's going to require me to have animosity within my own household. I'm not going to do that. It's not worth it. But Jesus is saying that he came for this reason. He came to set a man against a father, a daughter against a mother, in-laws against in-laws. And the enemies of man will be the member of his own household. Have you ever known somebody who experienced this? Have you ever known someone? I have. I've known a young lady when she obeyed the gospel. And when her parents found out she obeyed the gospel, they didn't celebrate with her. They didn't hug her. They didn't say congratulations. You know what they did? They disowned her and they kicked her out of her house. Threw all of her belongings out of the house on the front porch or the front yard for her to get. They wanted nothing to do with her, thus fulfilling what Jesus said right here. But then he says this, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. You see what Jesus is saying? He's saying, look, you want to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? You want to be a disciple of me? You want to follow me? Then you need to understand the cost. You must love me more than all other things. You must love me more than your mother. You must love me more than your father. You must love me more than your children. You must love me more than your grandparents. You must love me more than your parents. You must love me more than all. And he said the one who does not is not worthy of him. And so we look around. Some of us have children, some of us have grandchildren, some of us has mothers and fathers. And we ask ourselves, well, will we love Jesus more than all other things? Will we do that? I look at Zach and Levon back there. They got a precious little baby. Do they love Jesus more than their little baby? What a great challenge that is. How can you think about, here's a precious little baby. How can anyone love less a baby? I mean, the baby is the most precious thing there is. So how can somebody love someone more than a baby? But Jesus says that we have to love him more. Will we love him more than all other things? We have grandchildren right here. So Grandma and Grandpa is challenged. Are they going to love them more than all other things? Or are they going to love God more than all other things? We all have to face that every day. Because we're parents, we're grandparents, we're children, or whatever it may be. Who will we love? Will we love him more than all other things? Remember in Matthew 22 and verse 37, Jesus talks about the greatest commandment. What is that greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. You hear what he's saying? You shall love your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. In other words, we're to love God with every fiber of our being. Barclay puts it this way. He said it must be a love that dominates our emotions, a love that directs our thoughts, and a love that is dynamic of all actions. You see, we're to love God with every fiber of our being. And when we love God with every fiber of our being, what are we going to do? We're going to love Him more than all other things. We're going to love Him more than family. We're going to love Him more than you name it. We're going to love Him more than all other things. And when we love Him this way, when we love Him more than all other things, then we will be glad to keep His commandments. Remember, Jesus said in John chapter 14, in verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Do you hear what He's saying? If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And so you flip on over to, you go to 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, and it says, for this is the love of God. This is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. And His commandments are not burdensome. Now that had to be very meaningful to the Jews of Jesus' day, to the Jews of the first century. Because you had the Pharisees and you had the scribes and all of those religious leaders, the high priests. They were binding on the people what they could not possibly keep. And so Jesus say, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You see, they were laying heavy loads upon the people, loads that they themselves were uneven willing to bear. But we are assured here that His commandments are not burdensome. And if we love Him, we will keep His commandments. We will demonstrate our love for God. This is the love of God. In other words, if we love God, we demonstrate our love for God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome. So you probably ask, well, what are His commandments? Are you telling me that Christians are to be commandment-keeping people? And I'm saying, yes, we are. We are commandment-keeping people, or we're supposed to be. So what are the commandments that He's talking about? I would say this. The commandments that are found in His Word, the New Testament, these are the commandments that He's talking about. And so you can go through there and you can pick out all kinds of commandments that are there. The commandment to love one another. The commandment to win souls or to evangelize. The commandment to use our gifts. The commandment to worship in spirit and truth. That just is a few. Those are a few of the commandments that we're to keep. If we love Him, we will keep our commandments. And so we are to love Him more than all other things. He's to come first and foremost in our lives. We put Him above all things. And we measure our love for God by the way we think, by the way we talk, and by the way we live our lives. It's a good measure as to indicate if we love Him more than all other things. And so that takes me to the second point. Will we live for Him? When you consider what He has done for us, it's fair to ask a question, well, will we live for Him? In other words, will we give our life to Him, and will we live for Him? And that's what Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 is talking about. Living our lives for Jesus. I urge you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice. Do you hear what he's saying? Present your bodies to whom? Present them to God as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And so verse 2 describes verse 1. Living for Jesus, living for Him is living a transformed life. Not being conformed, but being transformed. Undergo that metamorphosis. Change. Change for the good. Change for the better. That's the idea of transformation. A metamorphosis is actually what it means. And in doing so, we're proving what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Present your bodies as a living, not dead, but as a living and holy sacrifice. Holy, set apart from the world of sin, and set apart to God. That's the way we live our lives. We're to live our lives that way every day we get up. Will we live for Him? And so keep that in mind, and then think about 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20, because they go together. Listen to what he says. You have been bought with a price. Who? You, me. We've been bought with a price. By the blood of Jesus Christ. We've been bought with a price, and therefore, notice what he says, glorify God in your body. So not only are we living for Him, but we are glorifying our God. We're glorifying God in our bodies. Well, how do we glorify God in our bodies? Well, in the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he's talking about not being attached or not becoming one with a harlot. So he's talking about you cannot possibly glorify God in your body if you're engaging in immorality. But it isn't limited just to immorality. We can glorify God in our bodies in many other ways. Think about this for a moment. We're to give Him a life of service. We're to live the transformed life. We're to let Him use us in a way in which it's going to bring glory to Him. You remember when Jesus was about to go to the cross, and He prayed that He would be glorified so that the Father would be glorified? How was He going to glorify God? Through suffering and death. He was going to glorify Him. What about the Apostle Paul? Did he glorify God in his body? He did. Do you remember when he and Silas were in prison and it was midnight and they were singing hymns and they were praying and all of those were watching? Do you think maybe God was being glorified? Yes, He was. Under very difficult circumstances, they were glorifying God. What about Stephen? Was he glorifying God? Even when he was on trial? When he was standing before all of those Jews who could not stand him because he told them the truth? And he called them stiff-necked and uncircumcised of the heart? Was he glorifying God? He was. Even while being persecuted, he was glorifying God in his body. And so it doesn't have to be limited just to immorality. We can glorify God with our bodies on a daily basis. So regardless of how we look or how much money we have or how well we speak or where we work and live, whether we are tall or short, big or small, attractive or unattractive, we are to glorify God in our bodies. If we experience extreme misfortune or never experience misfortune, we're to glorify God in our bodies. If we are seriously ill or if we are in perfect health, we are to glorify God in our bodies. I know of a young man. He's probably in his mid-20s now, but he was born with a birth defect. He's never been able to walk without the help of crutches. He couldn't do all the things that other boys and girls would do in his neighborhood. He couldn't run, he couldn't play, he couldn't engage in sports. He couldn't play basketball, he couldn't play baseball, he couldn't play football. You know, all of those things that you and I did as children and as teenagers. He couldn't play hide and seek. He couldn't play capture the flag. Whatever it was, he couldn't do it. Because he was limited in mobility. He couldn't walk. And he needed crutches to be able to get around. But here's what he could do. He could stand up at a pulpit. He could walk up, stand before the congregation, and pray. He could go to a classroom and he could teach class. Again, he could go up to the pulpit and for 30 minutes he could preach a sermon. Was he glorifying God in his body? He was. He was. Some of you will remember Joan Fowler's mother, Sammy Samuels. What a sweet lady she was. What a sweet lady she was. She became a Christian later in life. And she lived a long, long life. And so I would go visit her on numerous occasions. We always had the best visits when I would go and visit her. But she was unable to get out by herself. She couldn't go anywhere without the help of her daughter, Joan. And she walked with a walker. And she was always in excruciating pain because of her back. She just had a really bad back and she'd have to wear a brace. And she was always hurting, but she was never, ever complaining. I would go and visit with her and we'd talk for a while and say, well, how you doing? She says, oh, I'm blessed because of God. And knowing that she was in pain. But she always praised God. And on her table, if you ever visited her, she had a table. Not only did she have puzzles there, but she had cards there. And these cards were for the purpose of writing to encourage others. Was she glorifying God in her body? She was. She presented her body to God as a living sacrifice, as a living and holy sacrifice. And so these are some examples of how we can glorify God in our body, how we can present our bodies to God as a living and holy sacrifice. But then you think about some of the other things. How do we glorify God in our bodies? Well, when you look at these passages in Luke 9 and verse 23, we glorify God in our bodies by picking up our cross daily, denying ourselves and following Him. We glorify God in our body by trusting in and relying on Him rather than trusting in our possessions. Luke chapter 14 and verse 33. We glorify God in our bodies by seeking first His kingdom and His righteousness. Matthew 6 and verse 33. And we glorify Him and we are presenting ourselves to Him as a living and holy sacrifice when we walk by the Spirit and not carry out the desires of the flesh. Galatians 5, 22 and 23. And we glorify God in our bodies when we live the crucified life. Galatians 2 and verse 20. Living the crucified life. When we do that, we're glorifying God in our bodies. Paul lived a very hard life as a Christian. He endured things that you and I would never want to experience. And yet he would say, I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. You hear what he said? I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. When we talk about the thorn in the flesh, he would say, when I am weak, then I am strong. Only one who has given himself to God as a living and holy sacrifice can say that. And when we live and give ourselves to God, when we live for Him, keeping Him first in our lives, then we will be able to do all things through Him that strengthens us. And that means then that if we have habits, He can help us overcome those habits. If we have an addiction, He can help us overcome that addiction. If we have a real love for the desires of the flesh, He can help us overcome the desires of the flesh. If we're being pulled by the world and we just can't seem to get enough, the things that the world offers. He can help us overcome those things because Christ is our strength. Will we live for Him? And finally, will we give Him our money? Will we love Him? Will we live for Him? Will we give Him our money? You know, this perhaps is the greatest challenge for a Christian, is to depart from their money. It really is. Because for a lot of people, money's hard to come by. And then only to give it away, that can be a challenging thing. It can be a difficult thing. Every Lord's Day, we observe the Lord's Supper, right? We do. Every Lord's Day, we observe the Lord's Supper. And immediately following the Lord's Supper, we take up a contribution. And when we think about it, how can we not want to give the Lord our money if we had just got through focusing on what He gave us and what He did for us? He paid the ultimate price. He gave His life for us. So why would we not want to give Him our money? And that doesn't mean giving up everything that we have, but it means be willing to give to Him as the Bible teaches us. And we're reminded in Acts chapter 20 and verse 35, there Jesus says, it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. Do you hear what He says? It's more blessed to give than it is to receive. Happy is the one who gives. Ephesians 4 and verse 28, we should be willing to give to the one who is in need. In fact, it says that the reason we're to work is so that we can share with the one who is in need. And you look at the example of the Christians in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, how generous they were. What a great example that is for us. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and in verse 7, where the Bible teaches that we are to purpose in our hearts as what we will give to the Lord. And so it means that there needs to be thought in this, not just haphazardly, but we need to purpose in our hearts what we're going to give to the Lord. And you look at 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2, not only are we to purpose, but notice it says that we're to give as we prosper. Give as we prosper. I'm thankful that we're not required to give a tithe. I'm thankful that nowhere in the New Testament are we required to give 10%. But that is a good starting point. It's not binding, but it's a good starting point. We always taught our children, well, you know what? That's a good starting point. You don't have to give 10%. Good starting point. But the point being is that we are to give as we prosper. Give as we prosper. In Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4, we give sacrificially. We give sacrificially. And then in Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 24, after we consider all of these things, we want to make sure that we are not focusing on the things of the earth, but that we're focusing on the things above. And therefore we do not store up for ourselves treasures on this earth. But what do? We store up treasures in heaven. For where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. And so I simply want to conclude this evening by commending you, the church, here at Rockledge. There aren't too many churches our size that has the budget that we have. You are to be commended for your giving. And I want you to know that God has blessed you, and He will continue to bless you for storing up treasures in heaven and not on this earth. It is more blessed to give than it is to receive. Happy are those who give rather than receive. Jesus gave His life for us. He shed His blood for us. He ransomed us. He saved us. He rescued us. He pardoned us, and He gifted us. What will we do for Jesus? If you need to respond in any way, we want to encourage you to come while we stand and sing.